What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Alright, so as we continue with our discussions on the Walking Dead comic book series, in the last video, that was a lot of exposition, right? I mean, it was a lot of explanation, it was a lot of discussion. It was really one of those kind of filler issues. It's not to say it was a bad thing, not at all. I've never really been disappointed by Kirkman during his run on The Walking Dead. It's been nothing short of spectacular. I guess really his creation of The Walking Dead. It's always been good, you know, from volume 1 all the way up until right now. But the last one was really just designed to kind of set the stage. And the reason for that was because following All-Out War, following the defeat of Negan, it was really him just saying, okay, here's where things stand right now. Granted, it was a 2-year jump, and so we didn't really know a lot of what had happened over the course of those 2 years. But the first issue, I guess volume 22, there we go, more or less gave us some measure of an explanation of what had happened over those 2 years. But what this volume does is it also kind of continues that trend, but then it goes a step further with regards to the Whisperers. Now, initially in this, we pick up with Carl, and Carl actually receives a letter from a girl named Anna. And Anna basically says, hey, look, I'm sorry about what had happened the other night. Now, this is something I glossed over with regards to, the last video on The Walking Dead, because I really wanted to keep it confined to this particular video and this discussion. What happened was there was a girl named Anna who had basically invited a bunch of boys over to her house and then flashed them all. But this is really just Kirkman saying, hey, look, in this day and age when kids are, I guess not really kids, but when teenagers are being teenagers, they don't always know how to express themselves effectively. Now, it's not Kirkman saying that the kids are socially awkward. It's Kirkman saying, here's how they view the world. And the reason why is because right now we don't have a traditional school. There is education that goes on in Alexandria. There is education that goes on in the Hilltop and in the Kingdom. But in terms of traditional values, traditional thoughts, that's not been a major part of these people's lives. Instead, for a lot of the kids who are around Carl's age, maybe a little bit younger, they've literally just been trying to live. And so there hasn't been a whole lot of time to fill in the gaps of education that were missed between the time they started going to school and the zombie apocalypse broke out up until the current moment. And so it's really just them trying to navigate the world the best way they know how. At the same time, it also touches on this element of confusion because, being a teenager is a very confusing time for a lot of young people. I'm not going to go too in depth into the various experiences of being a teenager, but it's one of these situations where a lot of young kids are trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out, what their identity is, what direction they're going in, what they're about, what they believe. There's a lot of physical changes that are going on with their bodies that they don't quite understand. More so than that, because of the fact that their, emotional standing may be a little bit suppressed due to the events that are going on, they don't know, they don't quite know how to sit down and say, I like you, do you like me? Instead, they just more or less do it the best way they know how. Now, of course, Anna actually, in this letter effectively says, hey, look, yes, you're a really good friend, but I want us to be more than friends. The kicker with all this is that Carl is leaving, Alexandria. He's, going to stay in the Hilltop colony. And so because of this, he's no longer going to be a part of Anna's life. Instead, we're actually going to see him, at least it seems like he's going to be invested in a relationship with Sophia, but that's actually going to change. We're actually going to see him become involved with a girl named Lydia, and then things just spiral out of control from there. But at this point, we actually switch over to Magna. Now again, Magna was a character who was introduced in the last volume when we first were introduced to the Whisperers, and she was effectively a character who was much like Rick Grimes and his team when they first showed up in Alexandria, in the sense that when Magna gets there, her and her group are like, there's no way this can be true. There's no way this can be legitimate. People working together. This place is effectively as close to society as they can get in the zombie apocalypse as it stands now. But much like Rick Grimes and their team, their philosophy is if something seems too good to be true, then it probably is. The kicker with this is that once Magna was invited into Alexandria, and once she basically began looking around, she more or less came to the conclusion that this was legitimate. Now, following this, she had a sit down with Andrea, and this is what we get. We basically have Magna and her team sitting down with Andrea, and Andrea is saying, hey, here's everything that happened over the course of the last 2 years, and before that, here's the whole story about Negan. Here's the story about the deaths of Glenn and Abraham, and however many other people who died in the ensuing conflict. And so it's really just her kind of spilling the beans and telling them everything that's going on. Now, it's also kind of a coming to terms with the sense of Andrea making them as comfortable as she can. Because remember, as one of the core members of Rick's group, in the sense that Andrea was a character that had first popped up, when they had shown up, or I guess when Rick Grimes had traveled just outside Atlanta at the very beginning of the Walking Dead series. She's been there alongside Rick Grimes and as part of his, adventures, or not really adventures, but it's part of his experiences navigating this post-apocalyptic terrain since the very beginning. Now, we don't really know much about her story before that, but what we do know is that she's had to, she had to bury her sister. Her sister died. It was really just these circumstances where her life has been defined recently by these events. And so knowing how uncomfortable people can be in new situations, the best way for Andrea to neutralize the concern of Magna and them isn't to just, threaten them, isn't to cast them out, but to give them an open arm and to say, hey, look, do you guys want some coffee? We can sit down and have a conversation. And that's exactly what happens. Now, of course, they are met with the arrival of Jesus. And this is really just Jesus kind of, sitting down and saying, hey, look, just wanting to check and make sure everything's okay. Now, Jesus is actually going to turn out to be pretty badass in this story. Jesus is awesome in this volume. He's pretty stellar. But we actually end up jumping over to Rosita and Eugene, because remember, Rosita and Eugene are together, but we also learn that Rosita had basically cheated on Eugene. And during this relationship, or not really relationship, but during this affair that she had, she ended up becoming pregnant. So she's basically pregnant with a child that's not Eugene's. Now, in terms of this little expose here, this little element here, it's kind of strange the way this situation unfolds, because this is almost very similar to the events of Rick Grimes, in the sense that, much like the TV show, Lori had believed that Rick was dead, and so she basically had an affair with Shane, and because of that she became pregnant with Judith, who of course died during the events of the prison. But Rick Grimes he never really acknowledged the fact that it wasn't his. It was just something that was kind of left in the background, and it wasn't really until recently that he stepped out and said, yeah, the kid's not mine. The kid was not mine, it was Shane's child. Now, in this situation, Robert Kirkman nips this in the bud right off the bat. As soon as Eugene finds out that she's pregnant, he immediately also deduces that it's not his. But what he says is, hey, look, we're a family, we can raise this together. Now, of course, we also get some reservations from Eugene, in the sense that he doesn't quite know how to deal with this. He's not really sure how to accept this. But from here, we basically end up jumping to Rick Grimes, leaving Carl at the Hilltop Colony. Now, this is one of the reasons why I love what Kirkman's doing with The Walking Dead at the moment, with regards to his run in the comic book series, because he focuses so much on character. And I'll hash this over and over again. His development of characters is nothing short of spectacular. There are writers out there that could only hope to be as good as Robert Kirkman when it comes to developing characters. Of course, when you have a post-apocalyptic zombie story and zombies just walk around eating stuff, the only thing you really can do is develop the characters. But it works out great, because this is the quintessential example of Rick Grimes watching his son learn how to drive, or watching his son get his own car, or dropping his son off at school for the first time ever and having to go home. It's Rick Grimes coming to the realization that Carl is growing outside of his sphere of control, that Carl is becoming his own man. Now, Carl had to grow up wildly fast because of this whole situation. He had to grow up much faster than a child normally would, but it's also this recognition that Rick's son is very capable and also has to basically be his own man and find his own place. Now, we'll talk about the places that people have in the Hilltop Colony in Alexandria, the roles they serve, especially when we get to a couple of bullies that Carl beats the hell out of. But we end up picking back up again with Dante. Now, again, in the last video, we had talked about how Dante had gone on a mission to retrieve a guy named Ken, and the result was that he was our first introduction to the Whisperers. Now, with regards to Dante and these Whisperers, because of the fact that, he was more or less taken by surprise by some of them who had snuck up behind him after he was fighting off various zombies, they also start talking to him, and it seems like they're not entirely hostile here. That is to say, they just don't kill him right off the bat. Instead, it seems like they're just as curious about Dante as Dante is about them. Now, again, we'll learn a lot more about these Whisperers as time goes on, especially when we see the introduction of Alpha in this video. But the idea is that Dante wants to know what in the heck is going on, but the Whisperers say, look, man, keep your voice down. And so, of course, the first question that Dante has is, how many of you are there? And this is really one of the most important questions he's going to ask. And the reason why is because whenever it is that Rick and his team come against a new force, the first thing they want to know is, how many of you are there? Not necessarily so that they can just have a general idea, but so that if it comes down to it, they'll know whether or not they stand a fighting chance if some measure of a war breaks out, which it will. But this Whisperer basically says, there are many of us. Dante effectively came into their land, killed some of their people, and the Whisperers will basically watch them. This is why the Whisperers are so dangerous, and we'll actually find out why they're also dangerous as well here in a second, but they're always watching, they're always seeing things. But at this point, we end up jumping back to Jesus as he meets up with another guy that's basically monitoring this entire border. Now, Darius as a character is actually a pretty solid guy. I really liked him, in terms of how he was introduced, but the way he's depicted here by Kirkman isn't so much incompetent competent as a guy that takes a few liberties with regards to what his job is supposed to be. One thing to keep in mind here is that because the kingdom, the Hilltop Colony, and Alexandria have basically formed this sort of tri-city area of commerce and trade, these routes always have to be monitored. And the reason why is because Rick Grimes doesn't want to, decide, hey, I'm gonna go to the Hilltop Colony one day and then suddenly run into a horde of 5,000 zombies. And so the idea of these guys is to always keep these trails clear of bandits, of zombies, the whole 9 yards, so that no one ever has to worry about, traversing the routes between the Hilltop Colony, Alexandria, and the kingdom and end up getting killed in the process. And so when Jesus gets there, he's basically talking to Darius, and Darius says, yeah, everything's fine, everything's pretty quiet, but one of our guys had gone out. One of our guys, Nathaniel, had gone on a lookout or a mission or something like that, and he hasn't come back yet. Now, the reason why this is important is because Jesus is, or at least is more or less the guy running the show when it comes to maintaining security for the routes between these 3 colonies. And so if one of their guys is missing, it's like 100 of their guys are missing because they don't know what that means. There's no way Jesus could know. It's one of these scenarios where it's like this question, right and wrong do exist. And just because you don't know what the right answer is, and even if there's no way you could know what the right answer is, doesn't make your answer right or even okay. That is much simpler than that. If it's not right, it's wrong. And in Jesus's mind, it's the scenario of saying, if we don't know what's out there and one of our guys went missing, it could be there is a bandit group of 500 people who have interrogated him and are just waiting to strike. It's fear of the unknown. And so Jesus basically sets out and says, we got to go find him. We got to find out what happened to him, where he went, and we have to bring him back. And so when they get out there, this is why we learn why the Whispers are so extremely dangerous, because as they're walking along this trail, as they're investigating, the Whispers are behind them. But because of the fact that Jesus and Darius and these guys don't know about the Whispers, and they simply just see them as zombies, they don't pay any attention to them. And so this is why I say the Whispers are so dangerous, because how can you fight an enemy that you can't see? Now, we'll actually pick up with this here in a little bit, but we basically end up jumping back to the Hilltop Colony with Sophia and with Carl. Now, the cool thing about this is really just, Kirkman saying, hey, look, things are going to expand with regards to these characters. Things are going to grow. The 2 of them are going to end up getting together later on down the line. But, jumping back to Jesus, once they come across what appear to be, a multitude of zombies, they're suddenly attacked. And of course, we know these are the Whispers because they're wielding knives. And so in response to this, Jesus fights some of them off and then says, guys, we got to get out of here. But when he turns around, it seems like they're all being killed. And so this is more or less just a scenario where Jesus seems to be the last man standing. He seems to be, this one guy fighting for his life. And in a lot of ways he is. But this is also why I say Jesus is so badass, because he's going against every last one of these Whispers and taking them all out with the greatest of ease. Now, there is one particular Whisper that has more personality than the others. And this is actually a girl named Lydia. And once Jesus basically goes through and fights off a combination of these zombies and Whisperers, and basically gets to the point where he's able to help Jesus, this girl, Lydia, essentially begs him not to kill her. Now, we don't actually know her name's Lydia right now, but we'll find out here in the next little bit. So it's just kind of easier to say Lydia instead of just the one girl who's a Whisperer. It just, kind of makes a little bit more sense. But, at this point, with regards to Carl, jumping back with him and his, spending time with Sophia, the 2 of them do a lot of discussion here in the sense of, how it was that Sophia viewed zombies before, in the sense that she said she felt bad for them. And Carl says this is actually a really huge thing, because he'd never really considered the idea that zombies were people at one point. It was just, in order for us to live, the zombies must die. And so he was able to distance himself from his own humanity, and kill zombies with the greatest of ease. But, Sophia was able to kind of bring him back, to anchor him to reality, so he didn't end up so far out that he effectively lost his humanity. But while the 2 of them are, spending time together, they're actually met by a couple of bullies. Now, the reason why this matters is because previously Carl had stepped in and stopped these 2 bullies from picking on another kid, but with, one of them running up behind Carl and hitting him in the back of the head with a brick. Of course, they're ambushed, and then they begin to get into a fight with Sophia as Carl runs off. Now, my personal philosophy has always been that if you run up behind somebody or you use like a sucker punch or something like that, then whatever happens to you is probably something that you deserved. And that's exactly what happens here. This kid, these kids running up on Carl, hitting him in the back with a brick. Carl, at least it seemed like he was running away, but instead he didn't. He actually ran and he got a shovel and he started beating the hell out of these kids. Now, the reason why I think this was kind of a cool thing for Kirkman to do was for a couple of reasons. One, because it invokes emotion. I mean, you're just kind of like, dude, who the hell are these kids? Like they deserve this. Like they deserve to get the hell beat out of them. Because in truth, that's what you happen. If you jump into a fight with someone and you don't know anything about them, you're paying your money and you're taking your chances. Maybe you'll win the fight. Maybe you'll lose your life. You have no idea what'll happen. These kids more or less jumped in and got a lot more than they bargained for when Carl beat them within an inch of of their life. Now, the reason why I say this invokes emotion is because Carl actually starts to lose control to the point where it looks like he's going to beat them to death, and one of the kids actually begs for mercy. Carl doesn't give him any of it. Something else that I also hope you guys notice is that Carl's ruthlessness, his willingness to kill people, is almost indicative of Negan. And this is super cool because it's like Carl is becoming the next Negan. And I loved what Kirkman was, like, him toying with this whole thing. I loved that whole idea. Now, Sophia's just kind of watching these events unfold, but as soon as, Jesus gets back to the Hilltop Colony with this girl sitting on the horse, we also have Maggie who arrives out there to meet him, but she's also met by the arrival of Carl and Sophia. Now, this presents a really bad situation for Maggie. And the reason for this is because Sophia is effectively her adopted daughter. I mean, it's really, Sophia is just as much Maggie's child as Maggie's biological child, in the sense that, Maggie's been caring for Sophia for so long that it might as well be her daughter. She's taught her how to become a woman growing up. She's taught her the value of life. She's taught her some of the most important life lessons and has been with her almost every step of the way following the death of Carol. And so because of this, it really gave Maggie an inkling of what to expect in terms of being a mother when she gave birth to her own child. But the reason why this is such a bad situation is because her daughter, Sophia, has been caught up in what's going to turn out to be a he said, she said incident, and where Sophia does pass out. The question is what happens? If these kids say, well, Sophia attacked us, then is Maggie going to side with the kids, or is she going to side with her daughter? Because it's a lose-lose. If she sides with the kids, then basically she feels like she betrays her daughter. But if she sides with her daughter, then she's abusing her power as leader of the Hilltop. And so there's no way of coming out on top in this particular situation. And so, once she gets Sophia back into Dr. Carson and has Dr. Carson tend to her, we ultimately have her talking to Carl. But in the midst of all this, these two bullies' parents show up. Now, in truth, Kirkman's handling of the situation was a lot more reasonable than I would have been as a writer. These parents come in, they start screaming, they start hollering, Carl Grimes beat the hell out of our sons. As Maggie, I would have been like, either you can be quiet or you can leave. But Maggie's kind of like, look, everybody needs to calm down, everybody needs to relax, everybody needs to chill. Now, these parents, these individual people here are actually losing sight of their place in the bigger picture. And we'll talk about that here in a little while, because they're taking a lot more liberty and they're demanding a lot more of authority than they deserve. But we end up picking up back with Lydia again, and she's actually just a 16-year-old girl. That's basically what we learn, is that this member of the Whisperers that was taken by Jesus was just a 16-year-old child. And so again, this is really just Kirkman kind of bouncing back and forth between these two things, jumping back and forth between Jesus' conversation with Lydia and the events with Maggie dealing with these parents. Now, understandably, these parents are pretty outraged at the situation, but in truth, when it comes to being an authority figure, when it comes to being in charge and running a show, in truth, weakness is a downfall. And so if Maggie were to show any measure of weakness, it would ultimately lead to people trying to take her place. And so in my mind, the only way to deal with these parents would be to just get rid of them, to like take them out front, put them on their knees and shoot them in the back of the head or something like that. I don't know, or kick them out of the colony in and of itself. But challenging authority in that capacity makes Maggie look weak. Now, Maggie doesn't take that stance. Maggie actually says, no, you guys have to be reasonable, you guys need to calm down. I get you guys are angry, but then Carl steps in because the parents begin, arguing, saying, you need to do something about that child. You need to do something to get rid of Carl. And Carl steps in and immediately starts talking like Negan. And this is why I say it works out so well. This is why I say Carl Grimes is becoming the next Negan. Now, of course, the father immediately seizes on him. And this is really when Maggie begins to lose it, because it's really an adult accosting a child. And this is something that just cannot be allowed to happen in this situation. But of course, jumping back to Jesus, this is also when we learn a lot about the Whisperers themselves. Now, we'll learn a whole lot more when it comes to Carl Grimes, but what we get is this little bit of information in the sense that, this girl basically says, hey, look, yeah, I'm a child, but being a child isn't relevant anymore. In this kind of post-apocalyptic landscape, children cannot afford to be children. Children have to grow up. It's like that line from what is it, the Dark Knight Returns, that in a place like this, innocence cannot be allowed to exist. It has to be stomped out, because if children stay children, that means they stay naive. That means they stay unaware of their surroundings. They fail to grasp just how dire things are, and they become a liability to the community and to themselves. Instead of allowing that to happen, the Whisperers effectively stay, from the time they're children, or from the time they're born up until the time they become adults, they're groomed to recognize the dangers of the world. They're groomed to recognize how easily they could die if they wander off too far, or if they just don't wear their protective skin, how easily they can all come crashing down. And so because of Carl Grimes' actions, he's basically thrown into a prison alongside Lydia. And this is actually a really, really huge deal here, because this is, again, where we learn a lot of stuff here. Now, the funny thing about this is that Kirkman actually toys between the idea of manipulation and truth-telling. And what I mean by this is, because of the fact that Carl Grimes is still a child, in a lot of ways, he's a very, very impressionable child. Really, he could easily be taken advantage of if the situation were right. And because of this, it seems that the way Lydia talks to him, the way she says, hey, look, I'm really scared. Can you calm me down? Can you comfort me? Tell me about yourself. It's a scenario where it seems like Carl is going to be taken advantage of, like Carl is going to be tricked into giving information. Now, it doesn't actually turn out to be this way. Instead, it seems pretty legitimate. The kicker to all this is that Lydia has not had the greatest life. She's not had the best life, even among the Whisperers. What she basically says is that, the world is a dangerous place, that with Carl and his group being able to live in the lap of luxury, essentially by having farms, staying in one place, having nice houses, having beds, so on and so forth, that none of it can last. The only way to truly survive in the post-apocalyptic zombie society as it exists right now is to constantly stay moving, is to constantly move around. What she also says, though, is that the Whisperers are not inherently bad people. The Whisperers do not arbitrarily attack for no reason. They attack because they feel like they have a reason. And the reason why is because with the Whisperers themselves, they basically have a giant, landmass, in the sense that they move around with zombies and they consider that entire area to be their own. If an individual wanders into their lands, the Whisperers will kill them. And the reason for this is because the Whisperers have engaged a multitude of terrible people, bandits, murderers, so on and so forth. And because of this, there have probably been instances in the history of the Whisperers' existence where people have come in, claiming to have the best of intentions, only to turn around and turn on the Whisperers and probably kill some of their number. And so because of this, Lydia says, anytime that we see people that we don't recognize, we effectively kill them. We take them out as best we can and we eliminate them. And so what happens here, picking back up with Maggie, once Sophia comes to, Maggie effectively says, give me your side of the story. Tell me what happened from your perspective. When Sophia gives her the story, which of course is off panel, it seems like the story matches up almost identically with Carl's, and that's exactly the case. Maggie shows up to Carl in the prison and says, hey, look, Sophia's story matches yours perfectly. And so because of this, we need to figure out what's going on. We need to find a way to deal with these children. Now, following Carl's release, and this is one of the most important aspects of the story, following Carl's release from this prison and, being allowed to roam around and to be free, he constantly comes back and visits Lydia. He talks to her all the time. Now, this creates a bond of trust between the two, to the point that Lydia actually won't talk to anybody but him. And this is a pretty cool thing, because what happens is that while Carl is having this conversation with Lydia, he's also met by the arrival of Maggie and Jesus. Now, the intention of Maggie and Jesus is to basically interrogate Lydia, but the concern is that if she's been talking to Carl all this time, then she in turn will not talk to Maggie and Jesus. Instead, Lydia will only talk to Carl. That's their worry, and that's exactly what happens. When they get there and they begin asking her questions, she won't answer them. She won't talk to them. She won't really give them the kind of information that they're looking for. Instead, she largely only wants to talk to Carl. And so Carl routinely comes and visits her. Carl routinely comes to see her, and he actually lets her go. He basically says, hey, look, I'm going to let you out. I'm going to let you go free. The rules are this: if you do anything to try to escape, if you do anything to try to hurt anybody, it's going to look bad on me. And so because of that, I will kill you if you do any of those things. Now, this is Carl at his absolute most ruthless. And this is why I say again, Carl is becoming so much like Negan, because if you look at these things he says, if you look at the rules that he lays down, they're very similar to Negan. Negan was not an unreasonable human being, or I guess is not an unreasonable human being, but Negan always, reaffirmed the idea that they have rules because the rules keep them alive, which is true. Carl takes this same stance. The rules will keep Lydia alive. The rules will keep her from being killed by Carl. More so than that, I also hope you begin to notice that there's kind of a relationship that's forming between the two. It's not necessarily like they're actually dating, but there is some measure of attraction between the two of them. Now from here, we basically end up jumping over to Gregory and Maggie meeting with him. Now, the reason why this is kind of important is because while Maggie is the de facto leader of the Hilltop Colony, Gregory's been around longer than she has, and Gregory knows those families better than she does. And so because of this, she's really kind of looking to him as some guy that can help her navigate these uncharted waters of how to deal with these very politically charged situations. The problem with this is that behind the scenes, Gregory is working against Maggie. Because Gregory wants to reattain his position as being head of the Hilltop Colony, he actually meets with the parents for the purpose of killing Maggie. His idea is that if we kill her, things will go back to the way they were before, which, we can all basically agree is better than they are now. Now, in my opinion, I think things are kind of better, now, as opposed to when Gregory was in charge, but Gregory wants to go back to the way things used to be. It's really just, you know, a lack of desire to see things change. It's a resistance to change is really all this is. And so because of that, you know, once Maggie's in his house, he actually ends up poisoning her drink. Now, she begins to succumb to this poison almost immediately. And as she begins, you know, realizing what's going on, she starts to collapse. But then we also have Jesus who suddenly arrives. Now, of course, Jesus is easily able to overpower Gregory and effectively take him out. Not only that, you know, Maggie also taunts him a little bit and says, how in the hell could you possibly be a leader in this hilltop when you don't even know how to poison anybody correctly? And so again, it's really just kind of taunting him a bit. But switching back over to Carl and Lydia, this is why I say the seeds are being planted for a war between the Whisperers, the Kingdom and the Hilltop and Alexandria, because of the fact that this attraction between Lydia and Carl is progressing to the point that the two of them are, for lack of a better word, effectively falling in love. Now, the other interesting thing here is that it seems that Lydia is sexually active, whereas Carl is not. Carl's never experienced what it's like to be with a woman before. And so what happens is Lydia effectively introduces him to this element of, you know, of adolescence, you know, takes him on this experience, you know, of being with a woman. I'm trying not to be too uncouth, you know, when I say that, but following this experience, we actually learn some pretty dark things about Lydia. We learn that she's sexually active, not because she wants to be, but because she's been made to be sexually active as part of the Whispers. I'll go ahead and let you take that to its most logical conclusion for what it means. But Carl, after learning about all this, says, hey, look, that's not the way things are supposed to be. That's not okay. You know, you shouldn't be made to engage in these kind of situations with one or multiple people at the same time. And so what he says is, you know, look, we're trying to show you a better way to live. Like, we're trying to show you a way outside of what the Whisperers have taught you. Now, the cool thing about this is that Lydia is receptive to this. Lydia is receptive to the idea of not having to be part of, you know, that kind of a situation. She's receptive to the idea of not having to kill as a way of life. And so because of this, you know, she's becoming more and more attracted to Carl. And it's not necessarily because of a physical attraction to Carl. I mean, it is, but it's also an attraction to what Carl represents. Carl represents a better life. Carl represents stability. He represents reliability. He represents what it is that Lydia could have if she really, really looked to have it. The issue with this is that because of the fact that the Whisperers had basically tracked Jesus back to the hilltop, you know, where he had taken Lydia, they were waiting on their leader. They were basically waiting on Alpha. This is the first time that we see her. Alpha is one of the coolest characters in The Walking Dead, by the way, in the whole Whisperers event. But when she sits down and she has a discussion with Maggie, it's really more of this not really a powwow so much as it is an exchange. You know, what had happened is that some of the people from the Hilltop colony were basically taken by Alpha and by the Whisperers, and they were kept for safekeeping. And the reason why is because Alpha says, look, you guys have my daughter and I have some of your people, you know. And so what happens is Maggie basically says, okay, look, we haven't harmed your daughter once. We've done nothing to her. You know, we should have a trade. Alpha's the one that proposes a trade, but the trade should be, you know, you will get your guys back and I will get my daughter back. You'll never come into our lands again and the truce will be maintained. Now, the issue with this is that because they're Whisperers, there's no way to know where their borders are. The problem with this is, you know, the problem with this philosophy is that it basically puts the entire population of the Hilltop colony, of Alexandria and the Kingdom on house arrest. Because if they can't tell the difference between Whisperers and zombies, except for walking up on them and looking at the back of their heads to where the skin is sewed onto, or I guess the skin is sewed into a mask, then there's no way they could know. And no one's going to wait for a zombie to get close enough so they can turn around and look at the back of its head, especially when you've got like 20 or 30 of them around you. And so because of this, it's basically creating a situation where a war will be inevitable. It's just a matter of how this war will be triggered. Now, under normal circumstances, we would say, okay, well, maybe just someone who wasn't paying attention, maybe somebody who was being aimless would just wander into the territory of the Whisperers by accident. That's not the case. When Lydia is told that that Alpha is here, Alpha's there to take her back to the Whisperers, and that some of the Hilltop colony's members are going to be returned, she doesn't want to leave and Carl doesn't want her to leave. But Lydia ends up going anyway, just because of the fact that she realizes it's the safest option for everybody, in addition to the fact that she just misses her people. The problem with this is that because Carl is so angry about the idea that Lydia is leaving, because of the fact that Carl cares about her to such a degree, he actually ends up leaving the Hilltop colony and following the Whisperers back to their home. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained and you are enjoying this Walking Dead content, make sure you guys drop a like and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you guys hit the sub button too, become part of the Rob Corps. Yeah. And yeah, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.